o'clock, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm proud to introduce Dr. Gary Duhon. He is a school psychologist and board-certified behavioral analyst. He's consulted both nationally and locally with Oklahoma schools on MTSS for over 20 years. He's trained numerous school psychologists who work in schools and clinical settings across Oklahoma. Additionally, he's collaborated with the Oklahoma State Department of Education as both a consultant and an evaluator for multiple grants related to school climate, special education, and tiered systems of support with the Oklahoma State Department of Education. He is a professor of school psychology at OSU Stillwater, serving as a program coordinator and conducting research on academic and behavioral interventions. Dr. Duhon serves as co-director of the OSU Bridge Center. Welcome, Dr. Duhon.
Thank you for having me, Wendy, and thanks for you guys for showing up. Today, we plan on talking about intervention intensification. So, Wendy, do you want me to share screen? Is that how we want to do this?
That would be great.
Awesome. All right, I will share screen. Let me know what you see. Do you see my screen?
I see your screen.
Awesome. All right. So we'll get started talking about intervention intensification just as soon as I can get it. All right, do you see my screen still?
Yes.
Okay. I can't see you guys anymore, but I trust that you're still there.
We see the main slide and your next slide.
Okay, well, that's not what I want you to see. Hold on, let me get out of that. And let's try this another way. Stop sharing. Well, looks like I need 3 screens for this. Let's do this the old-fashioned way. I'll share screen and you guys will have to suffer with looking at my little boxes on the side. All right, so we're going to get started talking about intervention intensification. And the goals of this presentation are to review methods for intensifying existing interventions to increase effectiveness. We're not going to review methods for changing interventions or stacking additional interventions on top of existing ones. That's a whole nother topic when we don't have time to cover this topic and that topic. So we're really just going to talk about intensifying the existing intervention and how to do that. The agenda, we're going to identify the what, the why, and the when of intervention intensification. What do you do? Why do you do it? And when do you start incorporating that? And then we're going to review a structure for determining intensification strategies. I've got it sort of broken down to help people understand it, make it a little bit more simplistic. And then we're going to review options once strategies have been identified. So let's talk about intervention intensification first. Before we can talk about intervention intensification, I want to say one thing. We've got to define collectively what an intervention is and what it is not. When I talk about interventions, I'm talking about a very specific thing. It's a narrow set of specific steps designed to target one or very few academic or behavioral skills that need to be addressed, improve, decrease, whatever we're talking about, whether we're talking about increasing an academic behavior or skill or decreasing a problematic behavior. An intervention are the specific steps you go through to address that. An intervention is not a curriculum. An intervention is not a person. An intervention is not a set of materials. It is a specific set of steps that you go through. And it's important that when we're talking about interventions and intervention intensification, we're talking about one intervention, not a set of very different interventions. One of the things we see in the field a lot, a mistake that people make is they utilize intervention A on day 1, intervention B on day 2, intervention C on day 3, and then they keep mixing these things up and they're really not implementing one intervention. They're implementing several interventions. And as a result, it's impossible to intensify several different interventions. So when we talk about intervention intensification, it's the practice of altering the time, effort, and or resources incorporated into an existing intervention. Why do we do this? Why do we intensify interventions? To increase the effect of the intervention. We want faster change, increased retention, or enhanced spread of effect. If an intervention is working perfectly, we don't talk about intensification. But if an intervention is not working fast enough, we talk about intensification. Or if an intervention doesn't produce retention of effect, every Monday they come back and they've lost that skill, or that you start over from day one every time you take a break, that's a retention concern. And then finally, if we want to see a spread of effect, generalization. We always are very familiar with this phenomena of he's got it when he's sitting down with me, but when he goes back into the general education classroom, all of a sudden the skills are gone and he can't produce the performance. So these are the why we intensify. But there's a disconnect there, and I hope you caught it. The purpose of intensification is to increase the effect, but the practice of intensification is typically defined by a change in practice. In other words, you're changing something about the intervention. The change in practice will not always produce an increase in effect. Intensification is a thing we do, but the hope is that it changes the impact of the behavior of the intervention. If it doesn't produce a change or an increased effect, then we didn't intensify the intervention. We just made it more complex, more difficult, more time consuming, but we really didn't produce the outcome we were trying to achieve. It's kind of like that if a tree falls in the woods thing, did it make a noise? Well, if you increase the intensity of an intervention, but it didn't make it work any better, you really didn't intensify. You just complicated things with no real outcome. So when do you do this? When do we intensify an intervention? Well, you do this when there's a lack of sufficient response. The need to intensify interventions to increase progress for students to meet a goal. They need to learn at a faster rate, they need to retain this skill for longer, or they need to expand their performance into other settings or other areas. We want, generally, almost universally, the problem we see with the need for intensification is an insufficient rate of learning. They're growing at a slower rate than we need them to grow. Let's say you've got a fourth grade student reading on the first grade level. We've got growth, but the growth rate of the reading skill or whatever skill we're addressing is taking so long to produce change, they're never, ever going to catch up. That's a problem. Couple things to note. You must also be sure the initial intervention is being implemented as designed correctly and with sufficient frequency. If the intervention is not being implemented as it's designed, we don't want to intensify first. We may be abandoning an effective intervention that's just not being run well or being run enough. For instance, if a student is absent a lot, let's say they're absent 2 days a week, well, they're only getting 60% of the intervention. Why would we expect it to produce a sufficient change if they're only getting 60% of it? So we want to make sure that the intervention is being implemented correctly and with sufficient frequency. Otherwise, we don't want to start attempting to intensify yet. We want to address that first concern. You must also make sure that the initial plan made sense. In other words, did the thing we're targeting for intervention, is it the right thing we're targeting, and does the intervention match? If there's a mismatch between the intervention and the student's need, that may be why it's not working, and we may need to modify the intervention. That's a story for a different time, though. Intensification is not simply adding intervention time or making groups smaller. You'll hear me talk a little bit about time and about grouping and about setting in a bit, but that's universally not an intensification. If a student is being intervened upon, is receiving an intervention for 10 minutes, it would make sense that if we increase it to 20 minutes, that would be an intensification or an increase in the intervention received. However, if they're doing the same amount of work in 10 minutes, and when we add 10 more minutes, a total of 20 minutes, we're not increasing the amount of work they're doing or the amount of practice they're getting. We've not intensified, we've just stretched the time out. Example, if we're working on comprehension and we're having them read one reading passage and answer 5 questions in 10 minutes, and we say, well, now you have 20 minutes to do the exact same thing, we're not intensifying the intervention, we're just expanding the time. Intensification is about increasing intervention time or opportunities to respond within that time. We need to make sure that when we do give more time, we're giving more practice opportunities of the same intervention, or more interventions targeting the same skill. Maybe you could add a second intervention component, but you're targeting the same skill, or more interventions targeting a similar skill. These all produce things that would be for producing generalization. But keeping in mind, it's really important to know that just saying do it for longer doesn't mean it's happening with more frequency. So time in and of itself is not sufficient. Time with more practice is intensification. It also doesn't mean a smaller teacher-student ratio. It's something we see quite a bit in the field is, well, we're going to make the group smaller. Well, if they're doing the exact same thing with a 10-to-1 ratio, and then you move it to a 5-to-1 ratio, and you're doing the exact same intervention, the exact same amount of time, why would you expect change in the intervention outcome? It would be like me doing jumping jacks with 10 people standing next to me or by myself. It's still jumping jacks. It's the same intervention. But if you are going to change the ratio, are you changing the instruction to be more individualized? Are you providing more corrective feedback or more direct feedback? Or are you providing more opportunities to respond because there are fewer people to work with? So if you're reducing the number of students in the group, it's only an intensification if you can say that the intervention has become more intense, not just by number of students, but by some other mechanism. So let's talk about mechanisms or methods of intensification. There's several of them that you can employ, and we're going to try to break them down into different aspects. Lots of suggestions have been promoted: more teachers-centered systematic instruction, more explicit instruction, more frequent intervention sessions, longer intervention sessions, interventionists with greater expertise or specialization, more opportunities to respond, more time on difficult activities, added point system for motivation, lots of things added, but this feels haphazard and unsystematic. So I want to give you something that you can kind of take back and think through when you're thinking about a specific intervention, and how can we look at the components of the intervention to see what we can do to make it more intensive. So let's get more systematic. When selecting methods of intensification, 2 things should be considered: the problem being targeted, intensification efforts need to match the problem, and the components employed in the intervention. So what are we targeting, and what are the components? The intervention components and the problem type are our considerations. Intervention components are essentially the components of the intervention we can break down into antecedents, responses, and consequences. And I like this because it spells ARC, and it's something nice to help you think about it and remember. All interventions have an ARC. They all have an antecedent, they all have an expected response, and they all have a consequence to that response. And you can alter one or more of these things to intensify these interventions. When we talk about antecedents, we're talking about what happens immediately before the student is supposed to respond. For example, showing a flashcard with a sight word on it or a math problem on it. That's the antecedent, the stimulus we want the student to respond to produce that is designed to produce the learning. Giving the student a math sheet, questions asked of the student. What is this word? Gesturing to an instructional aid to help the student, pointing to a number line, modeling how to read the word. All of these are antecedent components to the intervention that set up the student to make the correct response. We can modify these antecedents in a lot of ways. We can intensify them by increasing the frequency of cues, making the cues more salient or noticeable, and or providing more details. Increasing the frequency would mean, instead of providing a cue every 5 problems, providing a cue every problem. That intensification, that increased frequency would be more intensive version of the intervention. And if you went from a group of 5-to-1 teacher-student ratio to a 1-to-1, you can increase your frequency of cueing for that individual child dramatically. So that's an example of when reducing the student-teacher ratio would actually help in intensifying, but it wouldn't help unless you increase the frequency of delivering these antecedent cues. Making cues more salient or noticeable. Sometimes students make errors because they miss or misunderstand the cues or the signals that tell them how to act or how to respond. For instance, a simplistic example would be math problems. The plus sign versus the subtraction sign. If a student forgets to look at that, they may add when they're supposed to subtract or subtract when they're supposed to add. So simply using a highlighter to highlight that cue would be a method of intensification. It could obviously be faded back gradually to make it easier for the student to pick up on that cue independent of that highlight, but it's a way of improving the antecedent. Providing more detailed instruction, more explanation, more descriptions, more frequent descriptions. These are ways in which we can expand those antecedent cues to make them more intensive. Now the response, the R in the ARC, this is the measurable and observable active response from the student, the thing we want them to do to demonstrate their knowledge or to practice the skill we want them to learn. For example, saying a sight word after being presented with a flashcard, reading a passage after being prompted to read the passage, answering a question about the passage, writing answers to math problems after being presented with a math sheet. These are all the responses we want to see. And the hope is that they're correct and accurate and rapid, but if they're not, that's when we want to modify. Well, ways in which we can modify is we can change the modality of response. One of the things you can do to intensify an intervention is simply change how the response is made, making it easier and quicker to produce the response. The example I use all the time is oral versus written. We want students to be able to produce accurate responding orally and written. But sometimes kids with coordination issues or orthopedic issues, or just kids who aren't that coordinated may struggle with writing. So it takes a long time. So within a 5-minute period, they may only be able to write 10 sentences or 5 sentences or something like that, or answer 20 math problems written because their coordination is low. But if we change that response to orally or typing on the computer, it's the same skill of writing sentences or completing math problems, but it's much more easy to produce that response rapidly. So instead of doing 5 problems in a minute, they might be able to do 15 problems in a minute. That increases their opportunities to respond and increases their learning rate. Reducing the set size of the required response. Let's imagine a student trying to learn letters and we give them all 26 letters simultaneously. It takes a long time to see growth and it takes a long time to learn. And some students, when given a large set to learn, forget the items they've learned as they're learning new items because the set is so large. So one of the things we can do to increase intensity is to narrow the focus on a few items, teach those to a high level of mastery, and then add new items. This modification of the set or the reduction of set size can intensify the intervention on the items we're focused on at that moment in time and can produce faster learning rates. And incorporating additional response modalities, responding paper versus computer versus orally, responding in front of me versus in front of another teacher, ensuring that students practice different modalities can also be a way of intensifying to maintain that performance over time and across settings. The last part of the ARC is the C, consequences. What happens immediately following the response? Sometimes it's providing the response correct or yes, praise, corrective feedback, whether it's correct or incorrect, telling them what they got wrong, being specific and giving them and having them correct it, feedback about beating your goal, rewards for beating your goal. All of these things are consequences and they're designed to reinforce the learning. when you talk about modifying consequences, we can simply increase the frequency. We can give them more frequent feedback. Instead of giving feedback at the end of the session, we can give them feedback during the session or at multiple times during the session or after every response. If you think about the difference between math problems in flashcards versus math problems on a piece of paper, if I'm holding up a flashcard, every time they get it correct or incorrect, I can give them oral feedback or verbal feedback saying correct or incorrect, good job, try again. This is feedback after every opportunity to respond. But if I've got someone doing a sheet of paper and they're doing a whole sheet, they're potentially doing 10, 15, 20 problems without any corrective feedback from me. The added corrective feedback can be very useful in increasing motivation and increasing learning rate. And it also is great for ensuring that they don't practice items incorrectly for very long before you catch them and correct that problem. Increase saliency of feedback, being very specific about what you want from them and being very specific in terms of the feedback you give them. Just saying good is oftentimes not sufficient. Being very specific about how quickly they did it or correctly, or this quality of that response can be a way of intensifying also, and providing more detailed feedback, just providing them more detail on where they're at and where they need to go. So now, when we talk about problem types, we also need to consider when intensifying how the type of problem you're trying to address interfaces with that intensification. Now, there's 3 different types of problems we typically work on. This isn't completely comprehensive, but most of the problems we come across when we're dealing with interventions within an MTSS model focus on either skill acquisition, skill fluency, or performance issues. Skill acquisition problems, this is really when a student's performance is inaccurate. They haven't acquired the skill accurately. They may be partially accurate, maybe they're 90% accurate, 20% accurate. They're not consistently at 100% accurate, and especially for fundamental basic skills, we want to see high rates of accuracy. Now, why is this a problem? If they don't know how to perform the skill, well, that's a problem. Example would be a student might be 40 words correct per minute, but he's 60% accurate, or 10 words correct per minute with 40% accurate. These are students who are inaccurate, and even though one of them is at 40 words correct per minute, they're missing a lot of words. Comprehension is going to be terrible. So these are acquisition problems. Skill fluency problems are a little bit different. These are students who are accurate, but they're performing at such a slow rate as to interfere with their ability to be successful. Performance requires too much cognitive energy, and the student cannot use the skill, I'm sorry, not still, but the skill for more advanced applications. And again, I do a lot of my research in math, and I see this quite a bit. If you've got an 8th grader learning algebra and they're still counting on their fingers and toes when it comes to multiplication facts or addition or subtraction, their cognitive energy is focused way too much on the basic calculations. They're never going to learn the more advanced skills. You can also see this with reading. Students who read at a very slow rate, they may be accurate, but they're reading at such a slow rate, they forget the content or they get discouraged about continuing on because it's so effortful to read. First example, 40 words correct per minute with 90% accuracy. This student goal would be 70. They're reading almost half of what they should be reading. Although they're accurate, they're very slow. Or a student is 10 digits correct per minute with 95% accuracy. We want to see them at 20 at least on sums to 9. And then you've got finally a performance deficit issue. This is when the skill is present. The student knows how, when, and can do it efficiently, but they just don't care to perform it. Motivation is not present. This performance is necessary to evaluate learning outcomes. We won't know if they can do we won't know that they don't have a problem unless they try, and trying is important. And one of the ways in which we do this is we test kids who have deficit skills or appear to have deficit skills under conditions of motivation. So for a student in the example at the bottom of the slide, the first time the student read the passage, they were 40 words correct per minute with 70% accuracy. We came back and we offered them a reward and they jumped up to 65% with 85% accuracy. Very different levels of performance, and it tells us a lot about the student's needs. So let's put all this together. Hopefully we can make sense out of it. If we look at the arc, the antecedent, the response, and the consequence, and we look at the problem type, to intensify an intervention, you can alter one, two, or all three intervention components to intensify the intervention. Each problem type is a specific option for each intervention component. So you look at the problem type and you pick which antecedent, response, or consequence thing you have the ability or want to change. So if we're dealing with a skill deficit intervention, where the problem type is they don't have the skill, they're inaccurate. The antecedent intensification, we could add more modeling for correct responding, something like listening passage preview or cover copy compare are nice interventions that are components to interventions we can add that are effective at intensifying the modeling component of an intervention. Or we can cue appropriate processes. We can point to the number line and model using the number line. We can highlight comprehension questions, strategies, and give them to the student prior to reading the passage. And we can verbally remind them to use strategies. These are all ways in which we can intensify by just adding something to the front end of the intervention. If we're talking about a skill deficit, the response intensification could be more opportunities to respond. If they're responding accurately, we want to give them a lot more practice and a lot more opportunities to respond to those items so that they can practice that correct responding. We can break tasks into smaller sets and teach separately. Sometimes too many items in a large group can be difficult, but if we break them up into smaller chunks and chunk those items, they can get through those practices more efficiently and more effectively. Or different response modalities can be incorporated into the intervention to make it easier and increase those opportunities to respond. So, and for consequence intensification for skill deficits, we can look at feedback on every item or just more frequent feedback, or we can provide immediate corrective feedback when errors are made instead of waiting until after they're done a whole page. This is how it might look in a graphic form. Skill deficit in acquisition, the student is inaccurate. Antecedent, response, consequence, antecedent, modeling, response, more OTRs, consequences, feedback. So if you're thinking about an intervention you have for a student who's inaccurate, you can decide which one of these components I can add to or intensify the intervention with as you're thinking about it. So this could fit with any intervention you're using now. Just pick a component and intensify. If you're talking about a fluency deficit, this is a little bit easier in my opinion, because when intensifying, antecedent intensification is setting a goal prior to asking for a response. These are students who are accurate. They're just slow, so we want to practice being faster. Or set a time for completion of the task. Timing and goal setting are two really, really simple ways of intensifying the antecedents. In terms of response, increased opportunity to respond is another one that's very effective. We can add another reading passage. We can increase the time to write. We can add more time to practice and expect more production. Increase trial repetitions, add in more practice opportunities for the same problem. So again, more frequent response over and over again. So if we've got them practicing 20 problems before, increased response would be to do 30 problems now. A consequence intensification would be to add immediate performance feedback, good job, more frequent performance feedback after every problem. If they get it wrong, stop them, correct that response and make them do it again. And then self-graphing is another form. It's where students graph their own progress so they can see the graph. And I can tell you, I've seen it a lot and kids love it. Kids really enjoy self-graphing. And this is fluency deficits intervention within the ARC options, fluency, slow rate, antecedents, goal setting, response, increase trial repetitions, consequence, performance feedback on goals. If you're working on fluency, these are ways in which you can intensify. Performance deficits are or can be some of the most complex ones because figuring out what the student will respond to is oftentimes very difficult. Performance deficit interventions, antecedent intensification, we can give them choice of instructional procedures. We can allow them an opportunity to select intervention, select when and how they want to do it. We don't have to be so rigid. If we're talking about response intensifications, we can allow for responses in various formats. We don't have to, again, be so rigid. If they want to do it on the computer versus the paper versus orally, we can have them respond that way, whatever way they prefer. And then consequences, a lot of performance feedback, self-graphing, reward for beating goals. When we're talking about performance deficits, students with performance deficits, what we're really talking about is kids who don't want to do it because there's not enough motivation or reward or reason for doing it. So we have to artificially give them a reason. That's where rewards come in. That's where incentive structures come in. And that's where choice comes in. And again, this is the breakdown. Antecedents would be goal setting, responses would be choice responding, and consequences would be performance feedback on goals. This is all of it put together. It's a little complicated, but if you think about it, select the type of, if you know the type of problem you're trying to address, skill deficit, fluency deficit, or performance deficit, you can go right to the intervention that you're using and see what components are available for modification. I've got some case examples, but I'm running over, I think. Wendy, we want to stop at 45?
Yes.
Yeah, 3:45. We could just ask if there's any questions at this point, and if not, we could move ahead.
Okay, that's a great idea.
Does anybody have any questions for Dr. Duhan at this point?
Can I ask the group a question? Do you guys think about your interventions with regard to skill deficit interventions, fluency interventions, or performance interventions? Or do you think about them as a reading intervention and a math intervention? And a behavior intervention?
Benjamin, are they able to unmute?
Yes. Holly's saying, at least her mic is moving. If not, they also could write in the chat. Yeah. Oh, hey, Holly, we can see you.
You can see me?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Well, I actually was having technical difficulties, so I just got on.
That's okay.
I told Benjamin I was embarrassed to get on this late, but I couldn't get my computer to work.
That's
Well,
okay,
we're glad
Holly.
you could join us anytime.
Oh gosh.
And this, this would be a good time to say this is recorded, and this will be put up on the module for implementation of MTS year one. It'll be a little bit before it's put up, but you will be able to access it.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, Dr. Duhan. Yes, I think we have a few more minutes if you'd like to go ahead.
All right, let me go ahead a little bit. We'll talk about some actual examples of how this could be done, make this a little bit more concrete. We've got Brandon. He's a kindergarten student who needs to score 35 to 45 on DIBELS phonemic segmentation at the end of the kindergarten to reach benchmark level. This is kindergarten phonemic segmentation fluency, a pretty basic skill. Based upon Brandon's screening assessment, he needs to make progress along the aim line to reach his goal. And this is what this looks like. We placed him on a tier 2. He received small group intervention on phonemic segmentation fluency from the teacher 3 days a week. So this is really old. If you've ever seen the old stuff, the old DIBELS stuff, this is what it looked like. Then you would put the students' scores from their benchmark assessment, and then you would draw the aim line to where they needed to be at the end of the year. Real simple, but really effective. And then you would track the student score across time. And if this is Brandon's progress, we can see he's not on target to reach his goal by the end of the year. The intervention's not working well enough. It looks like it's working a little bit, but I'm not really excited about it, and we want to intensify and move them up to a more intensive intervention because we want to see some growth. I'm going to skip Sally because I don't think I have time to do them both. But we'll talk about Brandon's intervention. To know what to do for tier 3 for Brandon, we need to answer a couple of questions. What type of problem does Brandon have? And based upon skill versus fluency versus performance, what is it? What does he have? What the specific? We also need to know the specific intervention that's being implemented in tier 2. So what type of problem does Brandon have? On phonemic segmentation assessment, the initial one, Brandon scored 3, 5, and 2 with 100% accuracy. We offered a reward to increase his performance to see if it was a performance issue, and he scored a 4. So Brandon didn't have a performance issue. He was trying. He didn't have an accuracy issue. He was accurate. What he had, it was a fluency issue. He was slow, really, really slow. So we considered it a fluency deficit. And so our intervention, we used the picture sliding intervention from Florida Center for Reading Research. They got a ton of interventions in on those materials, and group with 5 students and the teacher 3 days a week for 10 minutes. So we had about 30 minutes of intervention. We placed picture cards with individual stacks on a flat surface. The students chose a stack of pictures parts and put in order, leaving spaces between the parts. The student then took turns with each picture, the names of the picture and the segments of the words and the phonics, while slowly sliding the parts together. So, for example, the letters would be F-R-O-G. They would slide them together and say frog. Just an activity, right? That's the intervention. And we're progress monitoring with phonemic segmentation. So since Brandon is a fluency deficit, let's look at the fluency interventions. We can add goal setting or explicit timing. We can give them more opportunities to respond. We can provide performance feedback. We can do any of those things to intensify the intervention or any combination of them. So Brandon's team decided to add explicit timing. So Brandon has to blend the sounds within 5 seconds to try to beat the clock. We also increased opportunities to respond by having Brandon practice 1 or more stacks after other students are finished. So we did 2 things to intensify. We used the timer to time Brandon, and we actually increased his opportunities to respond. And then we started measuring progress again. And you can see here his progress every couple of weeks we're measuring it. He grew rather rapidly. So this intensification actually produced a positive outcome for Brandon. I'm not going to go over Sally because I'm running out of time, but hey, we did Sally and she grew too. Conclusion. Remember the arc. Intensifying interventions can be simplified by breaking down the problem and the intervention into components. Simply adjusting an intervention can have a big impact on the student's progress. The thing I hope you guys take home is it's a good idea to look at problems based upon those components I talked about earlier, and fluency, accuracy, fluency, and performance. If we look at it as reading, we're stuck with how do you intensify reading intervention. If we look at it as an accuracy intervention with using reading materials, we've got a lot of simple options we can utilize. All right. And now I think it's time to stop and see if there are any questions from the group.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Duhan, for being with us today. Like I said, this presentation will be available. If you do have any questions that you think of later, just feel free to send them to me, and I'll put my email address in the chat, and we can get those questions answered. Our next community of practice is going to be February the 26th. It's going to be feedback loops for data-based decision making, presented by Sean Beard, who is with Sand Springs Public Schools. It's aligned with Module 6, overview of fidelity of implementation at all levels. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you next month. All
Quiet
right,
group.
fantastic job, Dr. Duhan.
Quiet group.
Yeah,
hate when they don't
they
ask
always
questions.
are. They come back and listen, but they
do.
do not want to be vocal. But
Well, I almost
anyway,
chimed in to answer, but
it's fine. It's
Maybe
good.
that would have triggered some talking. We should put plants in. We should put plants in here, like people ask questions and.
Ahead of time. Yeah,
Yeah.
we can work on that.
So
We'll
what,
do
so
that.
give, if you don't mind, give me some feedback about that presentation. Do people think about interventions, acquisition fluency and no? What do
They
you think about?
should. I think
As
it's
reading
great.
and math.
Mhm.
I
Okay,
think they think of it as skills too. Like that's what I always hear is the skills, and then like you said, reading and math.
yeah.
Sorry,
Well,
Wendy, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's exactly what I was going to say. Yeah, I mean, and
But I think it's because it's tied to the standards too. So you're thinking it in terms of, okay, so the building blocks of reading, we're thinking about those are the specific skills that they need to work on. So I think that's more of how I hear people talk about it.
Yeah.
and providing broad, very broad,
Yeah.
instead of digging down into more specific skill building.
Well, and one of the things I like about approaching it from that perspective of accuracy, fluency, and performance deficits is I don't need to have expertise in the content area.
Mhm.
I know there are ways to intensify without being an expert in the content area. And there's a lot of
Mhm.
situations
Okay.
where we have people in the field who don't have the expertise.
Yeah.
Now, I would always defer to a reading specialist or a math specialist because they do have that, but a lot of times we need to be able to be effective without them.
Yeah, because we don't have a lot of
Yeah.
places don't have those resources.
Yeah. Or
Available.
sometimes the reading experts aren't that expert.
Right.
Oh, Dr. Duhan. Oh, yeah.
Not everybody's Jessica, right?
No, if we
Man, if
could
they were.
multiply her a few times over, that would be very helpful.
It'd be awesome.
Yeah, get her in front of some people as much as we can.
Yeah.
So,
All right, Mr.
anyway.
Benjamin, enjoy. When are you leaving?
Tomorrow I think at 10 o'clock.
Man.
Yeah.
Well,
10
have
o'clock
a
at night or
great
in the morning?
time.
10 p.m.
10 p.m. Out of Oklahoma
Yeah.
City?
Dallas.
Oh, so you're driving to Dallas.
Yeah, we might drive tonight or tomorrow morning. We'll see.
Okay. Well, enjoy, man. I don't know. Do you have a Facebook? We send pictures and stuff like that, and we'll see. Like, if you got one, send it to me so I can kind of watch it. I want to
Okay.
see.
Yeah, especially if you run into any Lord of the Rings.
I was gonna say,
Yeah, if you get
things,
Are you
Mount
going?
Doom, or any of that. You go to Hobbiton,
you find the
let me know.
ring.
Yeah, if you find
a
the
hobbit,
ring.
if you find a hobbit, shove it in your suitcase and bring it back. I want to talk.
You guys are so
And
And if you
funny.
find a ring, don't put it on.
Yeah,
Just-
yes, that's good advice.
Yeah,
Just bring it back.
yeah. Bring it back.
All
don't
right, I'll
put it
talk
on.
to y'all later.
All right, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
See you guys.
Yeah.